Welcome back to Resilience in the Shadows. I'm your host, Alex Peyton, and alongside my co-host and mom, Leticia Peyton. Today, we also have a guest co-host, Quinn Hebert, president of the TentMakers of Louisiana Board and Media Relations for the Society of St. Peter Damian in Lafayette. We're honored today to welcome investigative journalist Jason Berry. Jason's reporting out of New Orleans in the early 1980s first exposed clergy abuse in Lafayette, what many now call ground zero for the American scandal. His seminal book, Lead Us Not Into Temptation, exposed a web of concealment that spanned dioceses nationwide and became a cornerstone for survivor advocacy. He followed that with Vows of Silence, co-authored with Gerald Renner, which prompted Vatican scrutiny of the Legionaries of Christ. In Render Under Rome, Jason peeled back the curtain on the church's financial opacity, earning numerous awards for his fearless reporting. A Guggenheim and NEH Fellow, he continues to contribute incisive analysis to The Guardian and National Catholic Reporter. His forthcoming volume, Conversations with Jason Berry, offers an intimate look at the life and mind behind these investigations. Jason, welcome to Resilience in the Shadows. We're so grateful you could join us today. Jason, welcome to Resilience in the Shadows, and we're so grateful that you could be here to join us today.
Absolutely. Your work has transformed how we understand abuse, accountability, and healing, and we want to thank you for this time with us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be with you.
Jason, I guess I'll go ahead and start. Being the oldest person in the room here where we are, I grew up in Crowley, which is, not very far from where the abuse that basically started in the entire country, and you had a big role in exposing all of this. But what I simply find amazing is that, I'm sitting here today as the mother of a victim, but back in the 80s, I went to Catholic schools in South Louisiana, never, ever heard of this. So it's very interesting that you were reporting on it, but how is it that I can sit here today having said back in the 80s, even the 90s, up until 2018, I really did not have much knowledge of any of this.
Well, I guess it has to do with the way we absorb the news, the media that we're accustomed to. Of course, today, so much of the talk is about information silos and things like that. But, 40 or so years ago, when I was doing the initial round of reporting for the Times of Acadiana, the Daily Advertiser was basically attacking the articles as they came out in the weekly paper. And there was a good deal of television coverage going on as well. Of course, not everyone follows the news as other folks do. But I think the work that the Times of Acadiana did back then had quite an impact. And I was consistently receiving encouragement from people in the community, even lectors at some of the churches. When you work on a series as controversial as the topic was that I treated, there's usually an in-house expectation that people will complain, or you'll start hearing from folks who are angry about the Catholic Church being attacked. That really did not happen until the final article, which came out in January of '86. It was called Anatomy of a Cover-Up, and it dealt with 7 different priests who had been moved around. Father Goth, of course, being the most famous. By then he was in prison. And I think the impact of that issue came because Richard Baudouin, the editor of the paper, wrote an editorial calling on Bishop Fry to resign and calling on the Vatican to send someone new. And that triggered quite a protest from a very prominent Monsignor, who's now deceased, Al Segura, and Judge Edmond Reggie from Crowley, who together fomented an advertisers boycott And I write about this at length in the book, Lead Us Not into Temptation. Eventually, they called off their effort, which I think would have run into serious legal problems for them had they not. But the message I carried away from that is that you can attack the messenger, but what matters more than that is the message. And I think people in the community were quite supportive of what we did and learned by it.
So, from your vantage point, we had some discussions before, of course, having you on the podcast today, and just trying to get some of your opinions on the environment right now in the church, especially related to the clergy abuse crisis. So, from your vantage point, after Bishop Fry's removal in 1986 and then Bishop Flynn's installation, do you believe that Lafayette largely returned to its old patterns? And there was no organized survivors movement? I know you'd mentioned Chicago. What were the differences you saw in the way that communities moved on and responded to the news of the sex abuse crisis, especially with what you've reported on?
Well, you've asked a couple of questions,
Yeah.
Alex, so let me see if I can take them in turn. I had pretty much stopped reporting in Lafayette by mid-'86. And over the next couple of years, I was on the road a good deal, writing for other publications about events in Baltimore, Cleveland, San Diego, foreign countries like that. And so I wasn't really keeping tabs on Lafayette. I figured that whatever would transpire there between the church and Catholic laity would probably take time. And, I had a certain assumption that the church would not be moving around pedophiles as it had in the past. Hindsight in this case takes us to a report many years later by the Minneapolis Public Broadcasting outlet. This would have been maybe 8 or 9 years ago, I think, that did a real deep dive on Lafayette under Bishop Flynn, and reported that he had, in fact, done some of the things Bishop Fry had done. There has, of course, from what I've read about, been quite a lot of controversy in Lafayette about Bishop Desertel not revealing all of the names of perpetrators. This is happening in other parts of the country. So, in contrast, what I found in the late 80s, early 90s, and this is really sort of the last part of that 92 book, Chicago, of course, is a much larger archdiocese. The number of cases that began to explode, you might say, and the legal actions around them energized a number of the victims who began calling themselves survivors. There were two groups that initially formed. The one that has since moved forward prominently, SNAP, Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests, is sort of chronicled in that book, the origins of that movement. If I can get in one little shout out for myself, Rolling Stone later called the book the Bible of the Survivors Movement, and I was quite pleased with that. Organizing against the oldest church in Christendom and the largest organization in the world is not the easiest thing to do. And I think, to the credit of the survivors, their movement, and the various groups that, coalesce with it, we have seen important changes. The church still has a lot of reform to embrace, but I think the chances of a pedophile like Goth being just, in a cavalier sense, moved from parish to parish today is quite remote. And even though there are cases we keep reading about, and the issue of listing all the perpetrators is now front and center, even with all that, I think there has been important ground covered. The 2002 Bishops' Youth Protection Charter, not perfect, but a major improvement over the past, is there. It's for folks to summon and to use. The greatest problem is that there is really no mechanism, even with the reforms that Pope Francis propounded in the Vos Extus document in Rome, there is still no mechanism for oversight of bishops and cardinals. It's essentially come down to fraternal correction. And I think that is where the pivot point, if you will, of the struggle is continuing.
So I have another question. Just when you were talking about Goethe and not being able to necessarily exist in the same cavalier way he did back in the day, I know that this will be in the realm of opinion for you, and I'm sure there's other people that have opinions as well. What kind of, or how was an environment created even then where Goethe could be so cavalier, and what changes do you think happened that have stopped that from being able to happen or not happen as easy today? Because, I mean, obviously you would think even back then, it's not like maybe we have grown in understanding of pedophilia and how it operates and how pedophiles operate. But it seems even back then, like today, you wouldn't want someone like Goethe at your family picnic, right?
Well, if you knew his past, you would not. But the whole nature of the cover-up was the bishops sending priests into communities, not telling them anything about where they had been before or why. In most cases, many cases, I should say, they were sending these men off to treatment centers. And that became a major scandal by the late 90s. The fact that bishops were relying on psychotherapists and psychiatrists to write reports which would then give them a rationale to put these men back into pastoral work or clerical work of some kind. So why did that mentality pervade the actions of bishops? Why did they think in terms of sin on the part of the perpetrator instead of crimes being committed on children and their families? That's a complex question, and many people, I think, are trying to get at it in a scholarly sense. But it was really litigation, lawsuits, that kept pounding the church and costing them hundreds of millions of dollars, which in the end, and it took many years, for the bishops to see that sending a guy to a treatment tank was not going to guarantee that he would get out and be a good priest. What they had done all along was never report these men to law enforcement. And that is one of the more important changes that has come about, since Pope Francis's reforms and those concepts embedded in the Youth Protection Charter. How often is the charter followed? I mean, you could have a couple of days conference on that, but at least it is there. It's sort of a template. I think there was to your question though, Alex, I think there was a mindset among the bishops to forgive in a fraternal sense and to give a man the chance to carry on. And it was a flawed mentality. It did not take into account the families. It certainly did not take into account the victims. And that's one reason there are so many continuing lawsuits today.
Do you have an opinion as to why these men could not get beyond just the fraternal correction? versus seeing it as a crime and destroying souls of many, many survivors. I mean, not all of them, had lives that were completely destroyed, but I know they could see what these crimes against these children were doing to these families. Most people, I think, don't really realize that it was a lot of the big, devout Catholic families it was their children that were the targets. It wasn't just random children. So these priests were still constantly in these people's homes, and they could see these children with the effects of this abuse. And I have a hard time wrapping my head around how could you not see the effects of what you're doing to this family, to their children. How could you not see it as crime, but just let's go to confession?
That's a very powerful question, Leticia. I would say that in the course of writing that book from 85 to 91, 92, I asked myself versions of that question constantly. Why didn't they see, these bishops, what they were doing? The answer I came up with at the time, and perhaps I would amend it somewhat or expand on it somewhat, but I had a couple of reference points. The first is that the hierarchy, the bishops and cardinals, are a culture of men without women. And because they do not have children themselves, at least legitimate children, I'm not saying there are a lot of illegitimate children, but we know there are some. Bishop Casey in Ireland is a case in point. But these are men who are unlettered, if you will, in the vocabulary of child raising. They don't know what it means to walk the rug at 3 o'clock in the morning, holding that baby boy or that baby girl who has colic. And the absence of a maternal presence in that culture, in my opinion, and I have not changed it in 40 years, is a key factor in why you have someone like the bishop in Minnesota, Loris Waters, who in a deposition finally said, "Little boys heal." Imagine the insensitivity in a statement like that, the lack of emotional intelligence that would lead a man to make a statement like that. So I think it's the nature of the brotherhood, so to speak. And to me, it really does constitute a tragic flaw in a Greek or Shakespearean sense. When you're emotionally blinded to the reality of what your actions or decisions are doing to a great number of others, there's something fundamental that is missing.
You know,
That's my take.
I think I've seen that multiple times in person when I worked for the archdiocese. I remember there was a priest that I didn't like around when I was in, I think I've said this many times on the podcast, so probably don't need to go on a summary, but right when I had gotten married, my first job, because I needed a job, was as a youth minister at a church, which was, in hindsight, terrible job for someone who just figured out their brother was abused by a priest. But I remember there was a particular priest that I did not want around the children. And he wasn't even, supposedly wasn't allowed to be around them anyway. And I remember I had excluded him from invites from different youth functions. Whenever they would hold confession, when it was multiple priests, I'd block his door so that he would receive no confessions, and I'd send them to the other door. And I eventually got called to the office and, fussed at for it. And I was told, Father so-and-so loves ministering to children. And I said, well, it's not my problem. I'm sorry that he can't do that. I'm not going to let it. And I'll never forget, he yelled at me and he said, "Where's your charity to Father?" And I said, "Well, where is your charity to the children? Like, that's what I'm worried about. This guy has a past. We know he has a past. Why does charity to Father override charity to these children, which I'm supposed to make sure are safe in these church functions?" And he never gave me an answer. He got angry, but he never.
Alex, wait a minute. I have to ask a question. This was presumably several years ago, but you knew at the time that the priest had himself been removed for transgressions and was now back in the saddle, so to speak?
So he was removed for actually it was a national story. He was removed for sexual transgressions, but it was not against children. It was he had gotten it's a national story. He had gotten caught having sex with a trucker after Katrina in a truck stop bathroom. But the problem came in that when I was told about him, I was specifically told that he was at our parish so that he could be watched, and that he was not supposed to be alone with boys. And so that triggered with me. Now, there was no history, of course, apparently, right? He had never had, but that was told to me. So, once I heard that, there was no way he was ever going to get. And I remember at that parish as well, I one time had to fix his iPad, and, I couldn't help myself. I went to go look at the photos because I'm like, okay, well, what's in there? I could, if he's in something bad. And it was all candid shots of, glamour shots of teenage boys, and nothing illegal, obviously, right? But it was a gross experience. But it was funny though, because when you were talking about the lack of maternal presence there,
Grace.
and the lack of knowing about just how to, being with a child, it reminded me immediately how when I asked why Father's charity was more important than the children's charity, and no answer. I never got an answer on why I should prioritize this priest over, my children. So I think you're onto something there, and I hope that people can kind of separate maybe the whatever theological implications they may take from a statement like that, and just put that to the side for a second, just to see that statement for what it is, separate from any ideological footnotes or anything, because I think you're going the right direction there.
Thank you.
I do have another question. You are a wealth of knowledge here, and I think what's fantastic is not just that you have a wealth of knowledge from back in the 80s and that it remained there. You've walked well outside of Louisiana. You've crossed, not to take this offensively, you crossed some decades here. But so
it shows.
So in your opinion, in Vows of Silence, you unmasked Maciel, and in Render Under Rome, you exposed Vatican financial secrecy. What hope for reform existed back then when you were attempting that? And have you seen a genuine change at the Vatican since then?
Okay, I have seen changes at the Vatican. When I was working on Vows of Silence with my late colleague Gerald Renner, a dear man and a great friend, and I wish he were with us today, we were sort of dumbfounded that after this long initial article in 1997 in the Hartford Courant that exposed Father Maciel's long history of predatory behavior and abuse, that the Vatican simply did not respond. Jerry tried to get comment from them, calling them, emailing them, nothing. They simply did not respond. And that sent us a signal. The silence suggested to us that they were not standing by him, but let me rephrase it. The silence indicated that they were not defending him, nor were they going after us for exposing him. So it opened this kind of gray area that we kept probing. The men from Mexico who had bravely come forward in a country with a heavily macho sensibility back in the late 90s, where they would be derided as being willing homosexuals or willing gay people, when in fact they were young boys who were abused. All that drove these guys to go to Rome and file a canon law case with Cardinal Ratzinger and ask for Maciel to be removed from the priesthood. And as we chronicled in the book, John Paul was in a state of denial. Cardinal Sodano, the Secretary of State, was defending Maciel. As I later learned, after the book had come out and after Pope Benedict had removed Maciel, Maciel was steering handsome amounts of money to Cardinal Sodano and other cardinals in the Vatican hierarchy to ensure his own safety, that they wouldn't, lower the boom on him. So when you ask, has the Vatican changed? Yes, I think it has. Certainly under Pope Francis, the selection of bishops is much more careful and I think done in a different way. In fact, Pope Leo was the man in charge of that, and all the signs that we're getting so far are that he does have a pastoral sensibility, especially as evidenced in some of the situations in Peru with the cult-like organization that Francis outlawed. I think what's also happened in the Vatican is that you would not have the press office today never responding to requests such as Gerald Renner and I submitted before we went to press with our article. Typically now there is a response of some sort. They may say, well, we don't have information on that, give us time. Or they may say, this is something that the bishop in Peru has to handle, whatever the case might be. On the financial side, the Vatican Bank has gone through a long, tumultuous series of events. There was a trial in which Cardinal Becciu, who was one of Francis's advisors, was eventually found culpable, guilty, and he was removed from activity as a cardinal, but Francis didn't take away his red hat. And in fact, one of the last articles I did about the buildup to the conclave had to do with another cardinal from Peru who had a dismal track record, to say the least, trying to go in to one of these preliminary meetings when he had been banned, in essence, from Rome. So it is a complicated structure, an ancient organization. It's a sovereign monarchy of which there are no others in Europe. But all that said, I think progress has been made. It's incremental. It's never enough at a given time when a terrible scandal erupts. But that would be my response to your question.
Well, I do have sort of a follow-up on that. What about Rupnik? Because nothing has been done with him, his art, and that is something that I know I've talked to survivors of that whole, I don't know what you want to call that.
Debacle.
Yes.
The fact that nothing seems to have been done with the Vatican. So you say there are some changes, but from my vantage point, and, I'm just here in South Louisiana, what does anybody care? But I know nationally there are survivors who are really watching this, and this is a huge issue with Rupnik, what he has done, his artwork that is still across the world, and it seems like that would be a top priority for the Vatican to make some changes.
Well, first of all, I would never classify you as just someone living in South Louisiana. I think you have a grasp of this topic, and it's quite impressive. So don't short sell yourself, please. Look, I agree with you completely. And in a sense, it's another example of the flawed brotherhood mentality. The Jesuits finally kicked him out. Well, now he's still a priest, and his victims are becoming more and more vocal. And sooner or later, yes, they're going to have to do something. And I think it would be entirely appropriate to have all those mosaics or the artwork in the windows that he did taken out. I don't know how long it will take. I don't know where the case is. And please don't think I'm defending the system. But when you look at the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, I mean, you say that at a restaurant in New Orleans or Lafayette, and people are going to look at you. What are you talking about? Well, obviously, people who follow the church know that the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith is the old holy office of the Inquisition. It is in a huge building that I've managed to go to several times, where Galileo was tried for his sin of proclaiming astronomy as it was. And let's see, when Joseph Ratzinger was elected Pope Benedict in 2005, there were about 700 cases pending in that office of bishops who had sent dossiers for priests to be laicized, to be removed. And one of the men on that panel, whom I had gotten to know and actually interviewed, referred to it as their Friday penance. This is not a court of law as we're accustomed to in the United States, where there are two sides and a jury, and you face the judge if you're a defendant and so forth. These are a group of canon lawyers and theologians who read these dossiers and then decide whether to kick this guy out or send it back to the bishop. And it's an archaic form of justice, but it's the system that they insist on abiding by. Well, today, I think it's been reported that there are upwards of well beyond 1,000 cases pending. So when you have a bureaucracy that does not move fast, and certainly does not move at a pace one would expect when something as horrendously scandalous as this Jesuit artist, you sit back and ask yourself, well, what's it going to take to reform it? I would assume that he will eventually be excommunicated. What will happen to his artwork, I don't know. That would probably be another dimension of resolving it. But you're absolutely adroit in raising the issue.
And Jason, and after this, I'm gonna pitch in Quinn, because he's not gonna say it on here, so I'll say it. He's one of your biggest fans. But
I already told him earlier.
Oh, okay, all right, good, all right, good. I wanted to make sure you do that.
We get along quite well, by the way. We just met.
I do. Y'all would. I absolutely do. Y'all would. Whenever we said we were gonna have you on, I'm pretty sure Quinn was ready to leave at that moment to come wait here. Okay. I do have a question. It's a little more theological. It's a question that I know I've asked multiple times on social media and in my discussions with people, and it's a conversation that Quinn and I have often. If we were sitting here right now and we were talking about a massive conglomeration of corporations, or we were talking about a mega law firm, and there was sex and scandal and cover up, it actually doesn't seem like it would be as surprising or as shocking, right? We almost have an expectation that in those types of circles, I mean, some of that's formed by TV, of course, but in those kinds of circles, those kinds of things happen, and we cast that off as, that's how the secularists are. That's a part of the secular world, secular structures. When we're talking about the church, though, we're not talking about just a business or an institution. It's an institution that makes pretty lofty claims. Divine institution, led by the Holy Spirit, vicar of Christ as the head. What effect? I mean, when you're talking about like the systems of justice, etc. Yes, it's archaic. Yes, these men are flawed. What effect, though, do the church's own ecclesiastical claims have on our reaction to things like financial crimes, cover-up, archaic forms of justice? How does that work when we're looking at an institution that's making such lofty claims while also being able to clearly see everything that you've written about, for sure, and even things like Rupnik?
Wow, that's quite a question. Well, I would start by saying that if you look at the percentage of professed Catholics 20, maybe 30 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, it was about 26% of the population. I believe the number today is about 20%. The second largest number, and this, I'm citing the Pew Trust surveys, which are, about as good as they get. And I think the Georgetown Institute, CARA, Center for the, I always get the acronym wrong, the study of the apostolate, but they do survey data, I believe, with the National Opinion Research Center in Chicago. And the numbers are pretty consistent. The second largest group, cohort, as they say, is those who profess no religion, the nuns, as they are called, N-O-N-E-S, of whom the majority are Catholic. So to answer your question, Alex, there has been a slow erosion in the number of people who go to church and who believe in the church. Now, you may have people now, France is rather famous for having a high level of baptized Catholics. I think it's about 60%. But it's only about 10 or 15% who actually go to church on a somewhat regular basis. Now, you can cite all kinds of factors in the word you used a while ago, the term you used, secularism. But I think what's at issue here is people leaving because they feel betrayed and their trust has been broken. Whether they have relatives who were abused or a priest in whom they had trust was yanked, was moved, whatever the factor may be, and any one of these cases in a large parish, has ramifications and ripple effects. So that would be a sociological response to your question. I think on a deeper spiritual level, it's much harder to get a grasp. And I, for one, would look to certain works of literature. Louise Erdrich, for example, to my mind, the best American novelist we have, raised in a Native American community in Minnesota, and a number of her novels deal with the presence of Catholicism and how it sort of, like a tectonic plate, is rubbing against the Native American memory. And this is not to mention the terrible tragedies in those schools, like the industrial schools of Canada and Ireland and Australia, where, at least in the United States, many of these Indian children were sent and brutally abused either theologically and spiritually, or often sexually and physically. So in a sense, I look to you look at a film, a play like Doubt by John Patrick Shanley, who of course did the great film Moonstruck. And what's central to the story of that drama is the priest who has a past, the sister the religious nun who is doubtful and becoming emboldened, and the Black woman whose son is sort of at risk because of his exposure to the priest. It's a brilliant play, and it covers many of these issues, I think, in a way that you don't often see in the conventional, crime TV programs. I don't know, that may not be the kind of answer that you're searching for. I try, because I write about a lot of other things as well, I try to sort of maintain a certain connection to the consciousness of spirituality as it's manifested in different works of art and in politics demonstrations or what have you. But to say more in answer to your question, I'm afraid is above my pay grade.
Yeah. Well, that's I think the problem is I don't even necessarily know an answer, and I think it's a difficult one. I think I land somewhere on at least agreeing that the sex abuse crisis is the most detrimental argument against the ecclesiastical claims of the church for at least the past century, right? In terms of the church's moral authority.
I would go a step further and quote Andrew Greeley, the late Andrew Greeley, priest, sociologist, novelist. He called it the greatest crisis since the Reformation. And when you look at the numbers of people who left, as I cited earlier, that's one indication of it. But every time one of these scandals explodes, it's another hit against the spiritual life, the psyche, the mind of the church. And how do we get out of it? That's another question. But I think they've got to change the celibacy law, and I think they need to open up the seminaries to women. We need a theology of the family instead of a theology of the church, with no respect to gay people. I have a good many gay friends. I think the fact that the priesthood has become such an enormous closet is an indication of how unhealthy this rationalization of celibacy in the priesthood stands today. And look, you put families in rectories, you're going to have family issues. It's only a matter of time before somebody does a sitcom on the priest and his family. And here's the 15-year-old coming in. Gee, Dad, I like to smoke a joint now and then, and my girlfriend and I want to go off somewhere. Well, son, you can't do it. God doesn't. You can imagine the scripts and all that. But I think in a way, it's much healthier to have an idea of the family expressed in rectories. Look, a friend of mine, a priest who has since died several years ago, David Boileau, once said that, and this was about maybe 20 years ago, I believe the Archdiocese of New Orleans in that year ordained maybe 3 people. And he said Loyola in New Orleans had 80 graduates in its religious studies program, I guess, which is more than what theology used to be. And he said, imagine if only 15 of those people wanted to become priests. Well, you have all these cavernous rectories. It wouldn't cost a lot that are empty in convents. He said it wouldn't cost a lot to create some condos, let people go live there. give them a really good deal on rent, pay them a reasonable salary, and they could do the work of the church. You know, it makes sense to me. Instead, what we're seeing across the country is a fire sale of church real estate because of all these pounding legal judgments and lawsuits and bankruptcies being settled. I mean, it appears as if the New Orleans bankruptcy is going to be settled, within the next few weeks. So in a sense, this, there's another piece here. Many people don't realize this, but the way in which celibacy emerged in the Middle Ages was because the Pope feared that the children of priests would make claims on church property. And so there was this long campaign to force priests not to marry or to divest of families. And of course, the argument for a spirituality more akin to Jesus who did not marry was advanced. What you've got now is a celibate culture that is riddled with problems. And that's not to denigrate the work of many good priests and many good nuns. But in a structural sense, what we're seeing is that cornerstone of church governance costing the Roman Catholic Church, at least in the United States, according to the information I've been given, $10 billion over the last 4 decades. It's an enormous loss. Certainly those buildings, certainly those programs could be better used for outreach to the poor, for stabilization of people who are in terrible free falls. And yet it's all being sold off. Not all of it, but a lot of it. So that's the end of my answer.
Well, so since you brought up the seminaries, I spent 2.5 years at St. Ben's in Covington. And so I kind of understand the system of seminary. And in hindsight, all these years later, looking back, I can identify certain things that I would consider problems. So I was curious, from what you know, both back in the 80s, and I know seminary has changed, the culture of seminary has changed to a certain degree from the 80s, 60s, 80s, and now. I know Notre Dame and New Orleans had quite the reputation, even just a couple of decades ago. So what was the culture then and now, and how does that affect the new priests being ordained today?
Well, the reporting I did in the 1992 book reflected the seminary culture at that time. And the best I could determine, after a lot of interviews and reading a great deal of literature, including depositions, was that there was a pronounced gay culture in the seminaries, and that some of them became kind of hothouse environments. I'm not at all suggesting that gay people are more prone to abuse children than straight people. But these were environments that were not healthy and conducive to the formation of well-integrated priests. I have not done that kind of research in recent years. What I know is only anecdotal. But I see a great many of these young men. I happen to live 2 blocks from the seminary here in New Orleans, and so, I see them sometimes. In the past, I've gone to Mass at St. Rita, where a number of these seminarians go. And I don't mean to paint with a broad brush, but I will tell you something that Andrew Greeley told me. This was a year or 2 before the terrible accident he had and the brain damage, after which he did not really recover. he said that in conversation, and this is probably what, 2000, maybe 15 years ago. He told me once, we were having breakfast in Chicago, and he told me about conversations he'd been having with priests he knew in Chicago. These are guys who had come up, 45 years before. And what they kept seeing in these younger seminarians and recently ordained priests were men who were rigid, to use his term, self-identified JP2 priests, John Paul II. Well, John Paul was a global hero on the public stage in the dismantling of the Soviet Empire, played a catalytic role. And he himself championed the Legion of Christ religious order, which of course became mired in scandal under its founder, Maciel. And the Legion presented itself as a movement to reclaim the church before Vatican II, to evangelize a new church in a sort of fallen world. And of course, there are many other factors that lead to these young men who are not at all what you would call priests in the mold of Pope Francis, who famously said, "I want seminarians to go out and come back with the smell of sheep on them, be among the people." I'm not painting with a broad brush. I'm not saying this is the case in every single seminary. I have not done that research. But Greeley was a towering figure as a priest, as a sociologist. He, writing about the Catholic Church, no one had his authority. Front page obituary in the New York Times. And he said the problem with a lot of these young men is that they're officious. They want power. Well, I immediately began to think, gee, if some or any number of these guys who want power like that have any kind of psychosexual issue that they haven't resolved, sooner or later it's going to come out. How will it come out? So it's true. The screening is much more intense now, extensive. I don't know what that means with the numbers of the priests relative to the needs of the parishes that continue to fall. At some point, the church is going to have to smell the coffee and figure out a new way to evangelize.
Well, I think in just my opinion and my experience, the issue, the primary issue and problem with seminaries today, or at least from the time when I was there, is the problem of young boys receiving unearned respect. And like you said, it's a power thing. It goes to the head. It makes you feel like you've done something when in fact you have done nothing. And just in general, a tremendous lack of masculine maturity within the seminaries, and that translates into the priesthood. I don't want to go way too much into the weeds about all that, but that was my perspective of a lot of that. Do we have time enough that I can ask a couple of other questions?
You can have one more question, Quinn.
Okay. Well, I'm going to have to word this one very carefully.
Make it a two-parter.
This is going to be a run-on question here. Okay,
and your counterpart over here has been doing a good job with it.
One thing, and just maybe very briefly, because I know this is extremely specific, but in the first part of Lead Us Not Into Temptation, which I really appreciated it because it was the history of my diocese. And something that, so a very specific thing. You had a secret source that I think you called the chalice. And we later made the connection that that was Maura Dwight Hebert, I believe, who
Correct.
is on the list, who had abused children. Just curious, why do you think he came to you? And was there anything else, any tidbits of information that he gave you that you at the time weren't able to report on?
That's a really good question. I did an article identifying him in National Catholic Reporter. If you go on their website, the index is pretty good, and you should be able to find it. I don't recall exactly when it was. It was several years ago. I got to Dwight Hebert through Minus Simon, who was the attorney for the Gastel family, and their son, Scott, was abused by Goth, and eventually that was the first trial, civil trial, that the diocese had to deal with. And Scott was just a child, and he testified. I think you all are probably aware that he was recently tragically murdered or killed outside a bar, I think, in Cameron Parish, perhaps. So I knew Minus had a source because one of the legal documents he put into the public docket had a list of, I think it was 18 or 21 priests, and he wanted all this information about them. And I said to him, well, you've got somebody in the inside. You have to if you're getting these names. And he said, yes. And I kept working on him week after week. Would you get this guy to talk to me? I'll guarantee him anonymity. Well, finally, he did. And I met him. Went to his house. You ask about his motive. And this is hindsight. Based on the fact, as we later learned, that he was abusing children in a choir, I believe in Opelousas, was it not?
Well, I know we covered a story in Grand Coteau where the lady that we were helping, who was a victim, said that he ran with the priests and was involved in her abuse. But he was also, I think, in Opelousas as well.
Yes, it was Opelousas.
Yeah.
Yeah, but well, look, I'm not disputing what you just said. At the time, well, I remember when he was arrested, and a Lafayette policeman called me, and he said, well, we have Maura Dwight Hebert in prison, and we know he was your source. And I said, I don't know. I mean, I don't think I said, yes, he was my source, but I said, oh, that's terribly sad. And I even had a phone conversation with him while he was in prison. And it was pathetic. His voice was haggard. And I don't know. I think his motivation was revenge. And I think, again, this is speculation, as the lawyers say, calls for an opinion. But mine is that he was trying to deflect scrutiny from himself. I think he was also angry at least one of the priests, for whatever reason, I don't know. There may have been sexual activity there. He gave me a lot of information. A lot of information. I used maybe a third of it.
Wow.
A lot of it I held back.
Did you hold back just because it wasn't as relevant to the case, or could it not be proved? Was it what was the reason there for?
Yeah, Alex, good question again. Well, there were a couple of reasons, and you have to remember that back in the late 80s, early 90s, the Catholic Church was not under assault legally as it is today with all these bankruptcies. And in fact, when Doubleday offered the contract had been rejected by 30 other publishers. I mean, and the literary agent kept saying, these people are saying, oh, this is a great book. It's just not for us. And he said they're afraid of it. They don't want to get sued. And I remember the conversation with the acquiring editor, and this bears on why I only use a third of Hebert's stuff. He said, you have, and this guy was a former Jesuit scholastic, Tom Cahill, he's a great editor. He said, well, you have a lot of source notes reflecting documents, depositions, things like that. I said, yes. And he said, I trust you'd be willing to let our attorney review them in the vetting process. And I said, absolutely, you can look at anything you want. Now, this was before email and attached files. I said, yes, you can look at anything you want. All I would ask is that you reimburse me the Xerox cost. And he burst out laughing. And we cemented a pretty good relationship at that point. And by the way, Tom went on to fame and fortune and left Doubleday and Publishing altogether when he did a book called How the Irish Saved Civilization, which I think is 3 million sales going now. He was just a great man. Typically, investigative reporters hold back material just in case. If you have to go in and God forbid, get in a legal situation where you have to prove that you were right in what you did, you always want a little backup. But there was another factor. Not all of these men were publicly identified. In fact, of the 7 in that article I did in 1986, if memory serves, I think 2 of them I could not identify for legal reasons. Today, people identify defendants in lawsuits, sometimes even before the cases are filed. But I was very careful in what I was doing, and some of the material was really pretty shocking. I think I may have made reference in the book to a guy who always paid his rent in crumpled bills. Where does the collection basket go? Why he did it, I think there was a revenge motive, but I can't prove it. I have not gone deeper into his life.
Yeah.
By the time he was arrested and all this happened, I think the book was either done or close to done, and there's only so much you can do.
So Quinn had that amazing question. If he had like 5 more and we had another hour, I'd let him ask all 5.
I only have 2 more.
My question, I actually have a question that I was gearing up for, but I need to know the 2/3 of the material that you did not use, where is that?
First of all, I have made just recently, December, I donated most of my research files, 70 boxes, to Bishop Accountability in Boston. I still have boxes that I consider confidential that I'm holding on to. One of the issues of my life is storage space, but that's another topic. It is tax deductible. The twisted nature of some people who become what you might call whistleblowers, in contrast with people like Bob Hotzen and Tom Doyle, men who come out of religious backgrounds and have been so powerful and outspoken, is really quite a tale. And there's so many dimensions to this Baroque scandal that keeps developing. That's one reason I write a lot about music and I write a lot about politics. So I have another baseline in my life, and I listen to a lot of music. And anyway.
Well, but the last question before we go ahead and wrap this up, you talked about history a lot, and the history of the church, the history of the priesthood, how celibacy came about. People are pushing back, and I know they will push back. Faithful Catholics, people who call themselves faithful and devout Catholics, will push back on the part of, I know what you were speaking about, of having priests being able to marry, have families, and the value in all of that. When people push back, do you think it's a matter of if they would more or less go back and study the history of Christianity, the history of the early church, they would have a better understanding of how the church has evolved and these things have developed, and that moving forward is not necessarily going outside of the scope of Christianity or even Catholicism, but maybe going back to. And in some instances, people want to go back to the way the church was in the 60s, maybe the early 60s, the 60s, thinking there was no abuse there, when in actuality there was lots. So it has a whole big history of abuse. But if we go back and learn history, maybe we'll have a better understanding of the need to maybe abolish things like celibacy and the seal of confession, how that played into history, and all these other different things.
I would suggest putting much greater focus on the first century of Christianity, because I think there you find the struggle of the Jesus followers, many of whom, of course, were Jewish, meeting in small environments. And of course, the revolution of St. Paul is that this man coming along who never met Jesus travels the emergent Christian world with these stunning letters that build into the foundation of what we call the Gospels today. He was aided by women. There's a book I'm reading by Candida Moss, the scholar. It's in the other room. What is the name of it? It's about the slaves who wrote many of the works as dictated by Greek and Roman officials, and that even Paul had scribes. So, our sense of the enslaved, our sense of community has traveled far, almost light years, you might say, from the origins of the primitive church. And yet the role of women, who clearly were central in many of those liturgical communities, is one I think we could revisit. I guess at a certain level, I'm a pragmatist. The structure we have now has failed. It's failed on many levels. And however conservative a given Catholic may be, to say that we're going to go back to an era when the bishop was a prince and everyone sat in the pews and obedience carried the day is simply not realistic. It may work in certain corners or pockets, but the larger crisis is one that I think honest people have to confront. How do we change?
Jason, we're gonna wrap it up here with two last things. Number one, you have conversations with Jason Berry coming up. What inspired this? What themes do you visit? And what do you hope readers will take away? That was 3 questions, not 2, for the listeners who tuned in.
Alex, I'm beginning to get a sense of your methodology. Let me just say I'm impressed.
I know. I'm used to. I mean, we grew up with 6 kids in the house, so you got to get everything you need to say out in one sentence. You don't have a lot of time, you know.
Well, I'm not going to go near that one, but I will answer the question in this fashion. I only had 2 brothers. I will say this. The book, Conversations with Jason Berry, is a forthcoming book in February with the University Press of Mississippi in their series on writers and filmmakers, the Conversation series, as it's called. Howard Hunter, who is a friend and a colleague and a historian, his recent book, Tearing Down the Lost Cause, about the dismantling of the Confederate statues in New Orleans, which he wrote with James Gill, is a work of steadfast scholarship. And we've known each other for a long time, and I asked him one day, I said, I've got all these books, Conversations with Ernest Gaines, Conversations with Louise Erdrich, Albert Murray. And these books are basically a collection, an anthology of interviews and profiles of the given author. And I said, would you be interested in doing one on me? He said, yeah, I would. Well, he went well beyond what I expected, and he dug up all kinds of interviews that I had forgotten about. So, it's a bit of an oral history about my life, you might say, starting with the first book, Amazing Grace, back in 1973, and coming forward to the last one, City of a Million Dreams, which is a New Orleans history. And I hope that people who have read my work or are curious about it will get the book. Howard and I will be going out and speaking at literary festivals and things like that in the winter and spring of the coming year. And I'm sure we'll get to Lafayette at some point, and hopefully we can all continue this conversation, but maybe not with microphones.
We'll have Quinn pay for our lunch.
Yes. And I'll bring my book for you to sign.
Okay, that's very good of you.
Well,
I can bring more for you to buy.
Look, Jason, we are so happy that you came on. You were someone that I didn't even have on my list of people to bring into the podcast because I wasn't even thinking we would be able to have you on the podcast. I don't know why I imagined that Jason was someone kind of floating somewhere else up in the sky somewhere, not dead, but just somewhere else. But thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Thank you for talking to our listeners. Thank you for making Quinn's day. And we hope that there'll be a circumstance in which maybe we can bring you back to talk about something else.
Maybe we can talk about conversations in February.
That would be great. In fact, I'll be in New Orleans next month, so we can call and have lunch.
I'd love to do that. Okay, well, it's been my pleasure, and glad to have met all 3 of you, and look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you.
That brings us to the end of this conversation with Jason Berry. Jason, thank you for shining a light on Lafayette's ground zero and guiding us through then, now, and what's next. To explore Jason's groundbreaking books, Lead Us Not Into Temptation, Vows of Silence, and Render Unto Rome, or to read his recent reporting, visit your favorite bookseller or online at ncronline.org and theguardian.com. And don't miss his forthcoming Conversations with Jason Berry, an intimate look at the life and mind of one of America's most fearless investigative journalists and cultural historians. Across 23 compelling interviews, Jason reflects on the forces that shaped his work, from uncovering church corruption to chronicling Louisiana's cultural and political landscape. Pre-order it now with the link in the description. If you'd like to support TentMakers of Louisiana through prayer, volunteering, or a gift, please visit www.tentmakers.la. If today's episode spoke to you, subscribe to our podcast, Resilience in the Shadows. Rate us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube, and share it with anyone who needs hope and healing. Thank you for listening. Until next time, stay resilient. And remember, even in the shadows, there is always light.